Hi, I'm Neil Saunders and welcome to this week's edition of Retail Perspectives. Well, we're a little bit into 2014 now, so I thought this week we'd take a look ahead at what the year holds for retail. Now, 2013 was an interesting year because it was probably a year of two halves. The first half was quite tough, but as we moved into the second half, for retail things started to get better and we started to see some uplift. So we start 2014 on that more positive note. And the first thing I think that looks good for 2014 is consumer confidence. Now, in 2013, we entered the year with consumer confidence by our own index at about minus 38. So actually people were still feeling quite negative about the economic future. However, this year, from the latest confidence tracker we've done, we start the year with confidence at around minus 2 as an index. So although people aren't feeling entirely positive, they feel a lot better about the economy than they did this time last year. So that bodes well for retail and it bodes well for retail spending. But it's not the only positive factor that will influence 2014. If you look at the unemployment numbers at the moment, they're coming out quite well. Unemployment is still falling. We still have a lot of people within work, and those people are not fearing losing their jobs as much as they did this time last year. So actually the employment situation looks quite robust, and again that's positive for retail. The other thing that looks fairly good compared to where it did last year is salary increases. Now, although no one is getting massive salary increases, there's a little bit of evidence coming through that things are starting to edge up and that disposable income is starting to grow, albeit by very low amounts. But nevertheless, it's still growth, and we haven't had that for quite a long time. So again, that's another positive factor that bodes well for the coming year. The other thing that we started to see pick up in 2013 and looks quite rosy for the course of this year is the housing market. Now, housing was quite subdued during the depths of the recession, but we've got more transactions and we've actually got rising house prices, quite strongly rising house prices in some parts of the country. So again, that's another positive thing for 2014. What all of these things add up to, of course, is better spending. And when we look at our spending forecast for 2014, we've penciled in about 2.4% growth for all retail spend across the course of this year. Now, it's not highly robust growth, but it is growth, and it's the best growth we've had since the onset of recession in 2008. If you split that down into food and non-food, well, food we think will grow by about 3.9% this year. A lot of inflation kicking around. Non-food's a little bit more subdued, growing by about 1.1%, but there's still growth there. Now, of course, this growth isn't even across all sectors, as we've seen just with those food and non-food splits. We've mentioned food and grocery already. That's about 3.9%, and a lot of that is driven by inflation. Actually, volumes are still pretty flat within that sector. But there are other good growth sectors as well. Health and beauty, for example, we expect to grow by about 3.7% this year. Of course, that's a sector where you've got an ageing population who's interested in staying younger for longer. You've got lots of scientific innovation within the products, and actually people are still premiumising within that sector, so that's fueling some of the growth. Clothing and footwear, about 2.6% growth this year we're predicting. And here we've got a lot of people still buying into more expensive clothing, buying fewer items but investing more in statement pieces, and that's helping growth across that sector. So again, it's a good growth sector for 2014. The most interesting sectors, though, are the home-related sectors, because those are the ones that have really suffered during the downturn. And here we've got a lot more positive news. We expect homewares, so things like pots and pans and home textiles, to grow by about 1.5% this year, furniture and floor coverings to grow by about 1%, and even DIY, which has been really challenged during the downturn, we expect to grow by 0.4%. Now again, they're not fantastic rates of growth, but this is the first time many of these sectors have been in growth since the recession started, and that's largely thanks to better consumer confidence and, of course, the movement in the housing market. One of the negative sectors is home entertainment, which we expect to shrink by about 8%, but that's more of a structural factor. That's because people are digitising and they're actually buying digital editions of books and music and video, which is deflationary because those things are often cheaper. And of course, a lot of people, rather than buying music, are subscribing to services like Spotify, which doesn't count as retail spend. So that's one sector that perhaps isn't going to do as well. So overall for retail, it's quite a positive outlook. There are some downsides though. There are some negative headwinds that could blow in and actually blow some of these forecasts, these more positive forecasts, off track. The first one of these is probably cuts to government expenditure. We know that there are still some more cuts to come through, and that could have a small negative impact on what people have to spend, especially if it pushes unemployment numbers up slightly. Inflation is still very heavy, especially in food and grocery, as we've mentioned, and that of course does erode people's confidence to a degree, and of course it takes away the amount that they've got to spend on retail and discretionary goods. So inflation is still a problem. The biggest downside though, I think, is probably interest rates, because although they're low at the moment and that is helping consumers, there's only one direction they can go, and that is up. And actually, when you look at the data, consumers are quite worried about that. About a third of people at the moment say they expect interest rates to rise over the next 6 months. Now, in our view, that's unlikely. We think for 2014 interest rates will stay where they are. But that actually doesn't matter. The fact that people think they will rise means that they may take provisions to save a bit more because they think they may be paying a little bit more on their mortgage or their debt repayments. And of course, consumers are still very indebted. So that interest rate piece is interesting because as we come into a period of economic recovery, as we start to see spending recover, interest rates will at some point rise, and they will take some of the heat out of the recovery, and they will sap growth to a certain extent. The good news is that from our perspective, that probably doesn't happen until some point in 2015. So actually, it's not really a problem for this year, it's a problem for next year. But nevertheless, it is a negative headwind on the horizon. So the outlook for retail in 2014 is a good one. It's the best we've had since 2008. What, of course, none of this addresses is the structural challenges that retail face, because whilst the economy is improving and is getting better, and that's driving retail growth, many of the structural difficulties within the sector remain, and that's something we'll have a look at in next week's video.